You know, people are fine with the word consent. It's when you really start unpacking that and asking, what is consent? What happens when consent isn't there? And that's where it starts to get quite difficult. Asking For It is a 3-part series about consent, and we took a deep dive into what that means. Then we look at what happens when there isn't consent, and then we look at some of the solutions people are coming up with around Australia in terms of education and information and communication and events, and there's a lot of sort of surprising things that people are already doing to try and really get consent out there and get people to understand it and negotiate it well ahead of it causing problems for them. So yeah, there's a lot that we go into.
We always get the, oh, you're talking to 3-year-olds about sex. I'm like, no, not talking to them about sex. We're talking about hugs. We're talking about playing with a friend. You know, we're talking about consent in bodies. By the time you're then in, let's say, secondary school, and you're really starting to talk about nudes, porn, sexting, they know what consent is. They know the idea. They know about power, and they can so much more easily put it into perspective for them.
We made a 3-part series for SBS called See What You Made Me Do in 2021. We thought it would struggle to get an audience because the material was so difficult, but actually it became one of SBS's most watched factual series. And at that time, consent was in the courts. Consent had made it all the way to Parliament, and people were rallying on behalf of other women who were suddenly coming forward with disclosures about sexual assault. And people became really aware that this is not some kind of fringe problem within our society. This is really endemic. And so it just seemed like a no-brainer, really, to follow domestic abuse with the question of consent. And of course, the flip side of consent is rape. And that's, you know, where it was going. And then looking at our legal structures around that and how sexual assault is prosecuted. And the further into that you go, actually, the more shocking it becomes. Yeah, I mean, it's funny that even though I've been in this business a really long time, there were shoots, for example, for this series that I thought, wow, that was so powerful. And the whole crew felt the same. You know, we would do a shoot where we were kind of speechless afterwards, and then that wouldn't make the cut. And that continues to surprise me, that it's very hard to predict until you get to the edit what's actually going to fly. And I think especially for a subject like this, because there's only so much of it you can take, but there's also a whole lot of other really important elements, like you need to understand who the person is who's speaking, and if you have to anonymise someone, it can be really hard that you don't see their face, that you don't understand the details of their story because for whatever reason we can't tell it. So balancing all of that is really difficult when there's so much liability with a series like this. I mean, we know that people are suing and counter-suing all over the place when it comes to sexual assault, and that is an issue for us as well. We have to not just protect ourselves, but protect the participants and make sure that they're not going to be accused of defamation. And every step of the way, every word that everybody utters is potentially a defamation risk.
I did that whole freeze thing rather than pushing him off me because I didn't know about consent. I thought that it was my fault that it happened.
I didn't have much faith in the idea that factual television could be transformative. And yet, especially when See What You Made Me Do went out, the response was quite overwhelming in terms of people contacting us and telling us how that series impacted them in their own decision making and I guess access to services, and just making them aware of really important stuff that was going on in their lives or friends' lives. So, you know, when you get that kind of response, it does become an addictive thing when you're working so hard on pulling these programs together and getting them right, to know that, you know, this might actually chip away at something. This might actually move us forward in some way rather than just entertaining people. I mean, someone said to me, I've got a 14-year-old son, said, have you had the whole sex conversation with him? And I said, no, I've made a 3-part series instead. And, you know, I hope this helps people talk to young men and for young men to speak back as well, because that was something that we really discovered is if you give them the opportunity, a lot of young guys are really desperate to talk about this. Look, I hope it's conversation, but I also hope it's advocacy, that it maybe takes the heat off advocates who are out there right now and adds a bit of propulsion for them and leads to legislative change, and especially in our courts. And I think we're on the road to that. I think this is another tool on that road.